All right, so we're recording now. This is a vodcast, basically closely analysing one of the passages from the Quiet American. I'm actually doing this in my class at the moment with my students as a live audience, which is great. So we're going to be looking specifically at how we're going to use a passage from the Quiet American to draw out some ideas from that, and then we're going to discuss how we might use those ideas in our own writing, specifically creating and presenting pieces. So, the passage we're going to be looking at is from page 75, and we've got my annotated version there. What I might do first off is just read through the passage, and then you'll get a broader context. This is specifically where Fowler has introducing or describing a festival from Judaism, and the way he describes it is actually quite an interesting representation of the way that he views religion, specifically Judaism, but there are some broader concepts to do with faith and religion there as well, which the novel actually has some commentary on fairly consistently throughout the narrative. So we'll just read it together and then I'll go into specifics in a second. At least once a year, At least once a year, the Chaldeans hold a festival at the Holy See in Tunyon, which lies 80 kilometres to the northwest of Saigon, to celebrate such and such a year of liberation or of conquest, or even a Buddhist, Confucian, or Christian festival. Judaism was always the favourite chapter of my briefing to visitors. Judaism, the invention of a Cochin civil servant, was the synthesis of three religions. The Holy See. Thanks, Ryan. The Holy See was at Tunyon, a pope and female cardinals, prophecy by Planchette, Saint Victor Hugo, Christ and Buddha, looking down from the roof of the cathedral on a Walt Disney Fantasia of the East, dragons and snakes in Technicolor. Newcomers were always delighted with the description. How could one explain the dreariness of the whole business? The private army of 25,000 men, armed with mortars made out of exhaust pipes of old cars, allies of the French who turned neutral at the moment of danger. To these celebrations, which helped to keep the peasants quiet, the Pope invited members of the government who would turn up if the Chaldeans at the moment held office, the diplomatic corps who would send a few secretaries with their wives or girls, and the French commander-in-chief, and I can't quite see that because, there we go, I'm going to move this bit, who would detail a 2-star general from an office job to represent him. Okay, so the first idea that I've looked at there is the way that Judaism, which is specifically a Vietnamese religion, I think it was early 20th century that it was invented, but I could be wrong, is a conglomeration of different kinds of religions. So there we've got the Buddhist, Confucian and Christian, specifically referencing the festival there, but then it talks about the synthesis of those particular three religions. The Pope and female cardinals, traditionally cardinals or priests were not female, so we can see there's some egalitarian values coming through, which are not Catholic, which are probably from the other religions. Prophecy by Planchette being kind of like an older version of the Ouija board, whereby messages came through from God on a particular kind of wooden platter. Saint Victor Hugo and Christ and Buddha, two references there, one of them to the Catholic religion. Saint Victor Hugo was a Catholic saint. He was a really interesting mix between philosopher and mystic. philosopher being someone who uses their intellect to logically deduce logical conclusions or logically analyse ideas, but then a mystic as someone who felt like a personal relationship with God was possible and kind of channeling a relationship with God. So he's an interesting character, a Catholic character. Christ obviously being the centrepiece of the Christian faith, and Buddha obviously being the centrepiece of the Buddhist faith. No reference there to Confucius, which is interesting, I thought. So there's interesting mixes there of the different religions being put into one. Now, in a modern worldview, in our Western worldview, that seems kind of like a ridiculous thing to do. And so you get this, not a cynicism, but there's a playfulness here about Fowler's voice in the way that he talks about this. So the phrases that he used would show that playfulness are the such and such a year of liberation. Such and such being a kind of dismissive term. Notice that he specifically states that Kyadaism is the invention. So Kyadaism there is a human creation of a particular person who's a civil servant. So we get some political ideas there, which we'll get to later. But that taps into a broader idea of whether or not religion is a human creation or not. Interesting philosophical quote by Voltaire, one of the more predominant Western philosophers. He said that if God did not exist, we would have to invent him. And there are parts of society who believe that all of religion is actually a man-made thing. So obviously there is no metaphysical other, there's no metaphysical truth outside the material plane, but that religion is actually a fiction created by man to try and explain the world. Notice as we go down, there's this lovely description of Walt Disney, or this lovely reference to Walt Disney, obviously being the ideas there about being a cartoonist, and that there is a technicolor aspect, specifically referencing the film Fantasia. Fantasia obviously being the film by Walt Disney, which works in a lot of aesthetic pleasure, which musical, and then matches that with more visual aesthetics. And this is the way he describes this religion. So not only does it have a fictional quality, but it also has the quality of entertainment. Dragons and snakes, referencing the mythology. Well, look at that. There we go. We've been interrupted. Referencing the mythology and the way that has been used to convey some kind of, supposed truth. So in this way, that Kyadaism is seen by Fowler as being something that's entertaining. This kind of relates to, and probably we'll look at this a little bit further as well, relates to Marx's idea that religion is one of his most famous quotes, that religion is the opium of the masses. The idea there that, and opium is probably quite relevant to this text, the idea that opium is a way of placating the people. And so how does Kyadaism placate the people? It entertains them through a Walt Disney style show. Okay, and later on in the passage, I think we get quite a bit of cynicism through his language, which is Fowler's perspective in particular, and sits with his voice. So this is relevant later, but when we look at what Fowler says about a text, we've got to make sure that we put that in the perspective that this is not an omniscient narrator, this is not an objective voice, this is a very, very subjective voice, and we need to take into consideration Fowler's characterization. in that he's a character who's cynical, he's non-partisan, he withdraws from conflict, and he kind of has a questioning attitude towards all aspects of society. So this is no different. We have a reference here about the private army, which is fascinating. This private army, where with mortars made out of exhaust pipes of old cars, so there's a militia kind of aspect to it, where it's kind of the homegrown army, is grown from a religion which is supposed to be pacifist. So part of the Chaldeus religion is that they're pacifist. So it seems not a paradox, probably more a hypocrisy, that they have an army, 25,000 man army. But we see the pacifism when it comes to the next reference, which is that they turn neutral. So they're supposed allies of the French, but they run away whenever there's danger. So what's the point of an army if they just run away? So you have this kind of three-step hypocrisy here, where they're pacifists, but they own an army, but they don't use the army, and the army runs away from any danger. So that's seeming contradiction, I think. Next we get the idea of how they mollify entertain the people, where it's got the idea of helping to keep the peasants quiet. So the whole concept of that is to stop the lower class from uprising or revolting against the middle or upper class. So the idea there is to keep them quiet. So if you have these popes and cardinals, then if they put on a good enough show, if they espouse the right doctrines to keep the people subjugated, then they won't have any conflict, any class conflict. Peasants is a particularly relevant word there. So there's this Marxist idea here too. Then we have the different people in society reacting to these festivals in certain ways, all of them very cynical. The Chaldeus, so the government, who would send delegates, but only if the Chaldeus held office. The diplomatic corps, but only would send, notice it says their wives or girls. That's I don't know if you could call it misogyny, but it certainly specifically targets those sexes. I think the implication there is that they're not as important as the men. And then, of course, a 2-star general, obviously 2-star not being particularly high position. So then there's the military paying. It's not a genuine respect for them. It's a token respect for them. Okay, so this causes us to ask several questions. Now, remember that this is the point of creating and presenting. When we do creating and presenting, we look at the text, but then we draw our own conclusions. So reading and responding is commentary there from Luke. Reading and responding is about looking at the author's values. Creating and presenting is about looking at the author's values, but then drawing your own conclusions about them. So we need to draw out ideas from the text to challenge those ideas and see whether we believe in them or not. So the first question there is religion created by man? There are many different views on this. So there's a couple of different perspectives. I just want to draw out one in particular. Some say that religion is a man-made creation. Some say, and some are critical of that fact, but some say it's a man-made creation and they actually celebrate that. They actually think that religion is a good thing, and that it is created by man, and that we should actually be religious, even though these people would say that there's no God. So the contemporary philosopher Alain de Botton is one of the more prominent voices of that attitude. He's an atheist, or possibly a hard agnostic, who says there's probably no God, so all of the spiritual aspect of religion is false, but nevertheless, there are so many good things about religion that even atheists should be religious or should adopt some of those religious practices. Beg your pardon. So he wrote a book about that recently, and I can't remember what it is, but it's pretty cool. So that'd be worth checking out if that's a line of argument or a line of thought that you might like to follow. Second question is, potentially, is religion simply a reflection of a spiritual reality? We notice with Kyadaism, there's a pluralism about that, which is really fascinating. In fact, I'll get to that point later. What they would say is that they can see the whole picture of spirituality. That Buddha and Christ and Confucius were all on about the same thing, and so Kyadaism pulls them all together and says, now we know the full truth. So that's one interesting aspect. So that's religious pluralism happening in action there in Kyadaism. I think, just to speak briefly, the Christian worldview would be that Christ himself, that this would actually be true, that reflections of spirituality around the world are actually a reflection of true spirituality, like what is metaphysically correct or true. So there is a second plane, so to speak, in the metaphysical realm. But that when Jesus came, he was the messenger of that specific truth. So his words are most pertinent to the truth of that metaphysical realm. Okay, last question is, how can religion be used to manipulate others? And this one, I think, is particularly pertinent. We see Fowler's sarcasm and cynicism dripping through this, or permeating through this whole passage, and this is certainly his aspect. So we can see where religion, broaden this, religion has been used to manipulate others. As a class, we've just done the life of Galileo, where there is a deliberate governmental manipulation going on. The whole social realm is dictated, or the values of that realm is dictated by Catholicism of the time, by the Pope and other key religious figures. Another example would be radical Islam. So the manipulation there is, how do you get a young man to willfully strap a bomb to himself and then run into a group of people and kill them? How does someone get to that point where they're willing to do that? So there's a degree of manipulation, or you might say indoctrination, on the part of radical Muslims to be able to get someone to do that. On the other hand, you might also argue that everyone is indoctrinated with some particular worldview. So even if you were brought up in a home where, say, you were free to choose, or you didn't have any religious affiliation, there is a value or a worldview that goes along with that, which is actually could be your indoctrination as well. So you might argue that, yes, religious people are manipulative, or have been manipulative in the past. But you know what? Everyone's manipulative, actually. Even non-religious people can be manipulative. And we can see this from a broader historical perspective as well when we see Stalin. So Stalin was an example of communism in action. The ideals of communism were skewed by him to maintain a power and subjugate the people, and the manipulation of the people by his regime was quite fierce, even though one of the tenets of communism, specifically Marxism, was that religion was to play no part in society. Religion was banned in society. So it could be the case that not necessarily religious people or religions are the core manipulators. In fact, people with power are manipulators, or people who desire power are manipulative. Last one. This is, I think, for me, perhaps the most interesting one. What is the value of changing our beliefs? It tends to go back to a Socratic base, whereby you ever think about all the things that you believe. Imagine yourself in 20 years' time. What may have changed about your beliefs in 20 years? What might actually cause you to renege on those beliefs? How would you know? How will you know whether a belief that you have is true or not? What are the dangers of holding steadfastly to a belief and being ignorant of any challenge to that belief? So we can obviously see that with Pyle and his kind of reverence. I think there's a reference to this in the text as well, but he almost deifies your karting as a philosopher. And nothing that happens around him causes him to challenge that the pedestal that he holds your karting on. And that's shown to be incredibly dangerous. So this is an attitude of Socrates. Socrates was a bit of a pain in the bum, really. He walked around and he challenged everyone's beliefs, and people got really irritated at him. But there is a value in challenging our beliefs. There is a value in pursuing truth. There is a value in not simply going along with what we've been told, but to try and work through and find truth. Okay, really quickly, I just want to talk about the ways that we can write about religion and cynicism based on the Quiet American through the different three purposes. So expository, persuasive and imaginative. So expository, you can discuss the nature of truth in an expository essay. So what is truth? How do we find it? Is there an objective truth? Are we able to find objective truth? Discussing that kind of ideas. Specifically relate them back to conflict, in that they can cause inner conflict. If we find a new truth, they can cause conflict with others. Specifically thinking about, I can't remember her name, but recently in the news, you have a person from Iran, a woman from Iran who's come out as a Christian, and she has been sentenced to death in a couple of weeks from now because she has decided to become a Christian in a Muslim world. So, that whole idea of being in conflict with society, no matter what as you pursue truth, I think is quite interesting. I think with this one, you need to make sure that you evaluate Fowler's views. You can't just kind of absorb Fowler's cynical attitude and project that onto the page. You need to challenge his views. Expository essay is all about showing both sides and showing all sides fairly. So not particularly arguing one side through, but coming to a conclusion as you get to the end. So I think actually Green challenges Fowler's views, his cynical views as well, especially by the end where Fowler is forced to adopt a stance. So he's not allowed to be simply abstract and observe and criticise everyone. He actually has to partake and stand for something. So make sure you evaluate his cynicism, and specifically his cynicism about religion. That one as well, be reminded that Fowler ends up praying at certain parts. Actually, I think I might get to that a little bit later, but I'll speak to that in a second. So, the second thing that you do in an expository way is discuss a religious experience in a reflective piece. So this could be your own religious experience. This could be the religious experience of someone famous. It could be the religious experience of someone that you know. So discussing that and drawing out the potential conclusions from it would be a valid response to this area of study as well. Remember again to focus on conflict, the conflict that comes out of that. Okay, persuasive. You could argue about whether or not religion placates or incites conflict in an opinion piece. So this has actually been a very heated topic in the Western world lately, where you have Christopher Hitchens writing a book called God is Not Great. His argument is that religion has historically caused more damage than good. That perspective, I think, has been conclusively debunked by atheists, even though it kind of gets some traction with people who don't want to know any different. But I think that you could probably partake in that argument if you wanted to. Yeah, and I think it's important there not to generalise. So if you're going to do that one, you really need to be aware of both sides of that argument in order to have an informed view. Don't just go off. I've read pieces where someone's gone off and just kind of, with an unchallenged way, gone and espoused one angle or the other without being measured about it, without acknowledging that it's a complex issue and not very one-sided. The second option you could do is write out a transcript of a debate between a cynic and a religious person. So someone who's cynical of faith and someone who's religious. Beautiful opportunity for conflict there. So the transcript of that debate, a debate inherently involves conflict. And of course then you can use references which involve conflict as well. Don't strawman as well. So don't make the same mistake that Galileo made in his book, where he has projected a debate between two people and completely strawmanned one side. So make sure that you give adequate weight to both sides. You get some lovely opportunity for rhetoric there with your persuasive piece. Lastly, imaginative. Writing in a monologue of a religious person having a crisis of faith. I think that would be quite an interesting way. There's an inherent conflict about that situation. So something has caused them, something has been a catalyst for a challenge to their faith. And you get to unpack that and see the person wrestle with the ramifications behind that catalyst. Or, the flip side of that, Fowler is an agnostic, or probably an apathetic agnostic, having a crisis of unbelief. Or I kind of struggled with what to call that, because he gets to a situation where he actually prays. There's that whole idea of that there's no atheists in foxholes, that at a time of desperation even atheists turn to God and pray. And Fowler does this. Granger also does it later on in the narrative. And you might actually have someone there wrestling with their agnosticism in a time of crisis. You could write a news report in Fowler's voice describing the Kiardaist festival. In fact, I think that this one has the most obvious potential. Hi. Sorry, I know I'm talking for a while. This one has a really obvious potential to use the language from the text. When you read Fowler's description of the sorry, my voice is going. Good timing for it. When you read Fowler's description, sorry, I'm talking quite a bit, of that, then it's quite beautiful to read. In fact, the way that he writes about that festival is really rhetorical, really quite potent and quite fun. So you have an opportunity there, potentially, with Fowler's voice, because he's a journalist and he's supposed to be neutral, so remembering his neutrality, reporting facts, but then also remembering his cynicism and reporting those facts in a cynical way. So you get the opportunity to do that. Last of all, and before you go, Dylan, please always remember the context. Make sure that when you write a practice piece, you write to a prompt. Grab a prompt and make sure that your piece marries into that prompt. Preferably several prompts to see if you can twist it to those prompts. You can't ignore the prompt. Don't make that mistake. Make sure that the prompt drives your ideas. Okay, I think that was all right. We got there in the end. Oh, thanks. I'm sure hopefully you'll be able to use this later as your resource.